today what we want to spend a little bit of time talking about is some of the things that we've learned from the VR efforts that we've gone through, that we're still going through. And we kind of jumped in early as a publisher into the VR space. It's kind of a thing that Ubisoft does. We're very often early into new technologies. We have the shiny object syndrome going on when it comes to new tech. And so we've been in VR for a while now and thought it's good to share some of the learnings that we found along the way. We've got 3 games that are out in the market today. We have Eagle Flight, Werewolves Within, and Star Trek Bridge Crew, and 2 more that we've announced that will be coming out in 2018. And we'll talk about each of those today, Transference and Space Junkies, and some of the things that we've learned from the creation of those games and through the process of trial and error for what works in a new and emerging medium. So we start all the time by looking at what's fun, how are we going to entertain people, what is it that players want to do, why are they playing games, what's interesting about, in this case, VR, and why is it appealing to players overall. And we started with some preconceived notions, and I think the industry kind of did as well. And it was very interesting at one point in time to see how that matched with some of the survey data that came back. Google ran a survey. This was around the time that the PS4 or PSVR was coming out. And they asked a bunch of gamers what they expected from VR. What did they want? Now, I know what we started developing, and we as an industry started developing, and we went down the easy path of like, what are the things that we could get going pretty quickly? What were proof cases for VR? Where could we begin to, cut our teeth in the space? And when that was suggested to the players, not many of them actually wanted that type of content, right? They didn't think that that was what they would really expect to get on a PSVR unit or on any kind of a high-def display. Instead, when they said it's what they wanted, games that were much more like what they're used to, right? And those, that's where people were saying, I want games the way I'm used to being able to play those games. And this is where the beginning of the disconnect, I think, started early on in VR, is because what we delivered as an industry were those things where we were learning to begin with, and what the players wanted was something significantly different. And so when we look at it from a kind of an overall perspective, the viewpoint of the dream of the player in VR, right, is, as any number of movies you've seen, or Ready Player One, that completely immersed, I'm in another environment, I'm able to do anything I want to do, and we're not quite there as an industry yet. And so to talk about some of our learnings along the way, we're going to tag team back and forth here, Patrick and I. And Patrick Plourde, who's here on my right, is the Vice President and Creative Director of the Funhouse, which is in our Montreal studio. And it's a studio that's focused on emerging technologies. They're the studio that's behind Eagle Flight and behind Transference as well. And so he's going to chat for a while about our journey, and then I'll come back up and talk a bit more as well.
Thanks, Chris.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the VR dream. So me, I'm coming more from the developer perspective. So I'm in charge of a small division that is developing games, not publishing or so. So our role is to look at tech and go like, okay, what is the toyability of that tech? What's exciting about that tech? And that Ready Player One dream. So in terms of like, oh, I'm immersed in a virtual reality world. Where the rules of physics, logic is different every time, so it's another dimension that I'm visiting. This is my dream or our vision for the future. It's kind of like our Mount Everest, right? That's the pinnacle. That's the end of the journey where it's like, oh, you know what? You put the tax of putting your goggles on, and you're living, breathing in a virtual reality world. And that's, from our perspective, that's what we're good at Ubisoft, is to create those worlds, Assassin's Creed, Far Cry, etc. So that's the projection we're making. But the same way that climbing Everest, you cannot do it right away. Even if you're, after years of training, when you reach Everest, there's multiple camps that you have to go through, get acclimated, move on to the next camp, until you reach the summit. And that's how we're seeing the current limitation or our learnings that we have with the new technology, our journey to the summit. And the opportunity is that we can make every one of those stops interesting and engaging products and use the knowledge from every one of those camps and bring it to the final dream, the final vision of being at the top, being immersed in a complete simulation. So this is going to be like how we're structuring the journey, the step that we're taking, basically the little camps visit that we have to our dream. So the first one is locomotion. So everybody's aware in this room of the problem of VR. The first problem that people have is like, oh, it makes me sick when I move. So a lot of games dev, also some of the most interesting game on VR right now use teleportation. So that solves the problem, cannot move, doesn't make me sick. But at the same time, you already have the tax of putting a VR goggles on to play. And after that, you don't even have the freedom that ordinary traditional games are giving you where you can just move around everywhere in a virtual environment. So that's the double tax that the VR platform has. And for me, so the first question is, if we can't move around in VR, we're never going to achieve a comfortable way. We're never going to achieve the dream of being fully immersed and free in a virtual environment. So we need to solve that first. So this is our base camp, locomotion. So that was the objective for our team. How can we make sure that we have locomotion and then really stretch that question the furthest we can do to make sure that we're comfortable moving around in VR. And that's where Eagle Flight started. The first question with Eagle Flight was about, can we move around in a really comfortable way in a VR environment? And not only that, but at an extremely high speed. So yes, I can move around really, really slowly. It's boring to move around slowly. It's like, so like, can we have something that's really exciting and then really use those constraints to push our questioning to the end? So one of the first things that why it was Eagle Flight and why we played in Eagle, first there was the dream of flying, but also the headset by itself, I can look around, so suddenly I can control where I'm going with the head, which removes one of the problem of locomotion that makes you sick, which is strafing. Strafing is one of the biggest problem that you have, because then suddenly you're feeling even more the fact that there's a disconnect between the inner ear and what your eyes are seeing. So we used the head control and tilt control and force you to move where you're looking at. So that's one way of, first step for being controlled, to be comfortable. That was a right direction for like the start of our foundation. So as we were making this, then there's like subtle things, psychological tricks that start appearing to make things more comfortable. So the first one was, the fact that how we're perceiving the world. Everybody has a nose, and we're not seeing our nose. So technically, this helps give like a certain perspective to our game. So by putting a beak in the first-person camera, then suddenly it was, for the brain, way more comfortable. So that one was the quick trick that we found out. The fact that there's a relationship between close object and further object helps the brain go like, okay, I know where I am, I know where I'm going. The second one is what creates a lot of motion sickness is everything that is linked with peripheral vision. So as soon as there's a object moving quick in my periphery, then it creates discomfort for the player. The brain is used to focus. So like if I'm running really fast or if I'm focusing, then it's like it blurs the side of the brain, blurs the side of the image. So we use that trick for our game. So we investigated, so what if we just start adding blinders for players? So then it would remove the worst part of moving around in an environment. So horse blinders, a little bit too hardcore in terms of like, okay, how do I want to limit my field of view? Also, you feel it all the time. So it's sad that you have a wide view angle that those high-tech goggles are giving us. So we want to exploit that, but in a way that it's comfortable. So what we did for that was to create dynamic blinders. So the closest you are to an object at a certain speed, the more present the blinders would be. And because your brain is used to focus on the place we want to go, then suddenly those blinders becomes invisible because you're used to not look at anything that is in your peripheral vision when you're concentrated or going at a high speed. And that's what we did for Eagle Flight. So here, quick demo of like, you see as I'm moving, or I'm rotating really quick, I'm getting close to the ground. We would block the image, and it would be, the comfort for player would be drastically improved. So in the end, our game, so it's a game about flying through an abandoned Paris in the future. And you could, a little bit like in Star Wars, do dogfights, really, really fast in really close environment. And the result was pretty much every reviews that we get, every player feedback is, that game is really comfortable. So we achieved our way of, we can move around in VR and we can put that really comfortable. So that was our foundation. The way we can express ourselves in VR way wider, so let's move on to our second game. Now I know how to move around. Then the second camp for us, we started that project a little bit later on, was to check about how can we use the immersion factor of VR to tell stories. Because that's the best thing that VR is doing. Like you're immersed in a place. You feel proximity with the object. You don't have that on a TV because a TV is kind of like a window, and then the VR is you're like on the other side of the window. You can look around. So it's way more immersive. And so while we were looking for how can we push interactive narrative to another level, we looked at what other medium were doing. And for us, our inspiration was something called Sleep No More. So it's interactive theater. So I don't know if you're familiar with Sleep No More, but basically the quick wrap up, it's a full building where actors are performing a play throughout every room at the same time. And the audience is present inside those rooms. They're wearing masks, so they can, what you see as a member of the audience is just where you are. So if you cannot experience the whole play in one shot. And so yes, you are there, you're seeing, so that's non-interactive, it's just you have a different point of view, a unique point of view, which is interesting. But the other interesting part is that you can interact with the environment and find like hidden secrets, other clues for completing the story. So this for us was really exciting. You're present in a room, you have a story that is happening, and you can interact with the world to uncover more of that story. Take that, put that in VR. That's basically the idea behind Transference. So Transference is a collaboration between Ubisoft and Spectre Vision, which is a Hollywood production company with one of its founder, Elijah Wood, and his partner. And yeah, so our objective, or good video game people we're good at making mechanics and gameplay. We don't have such a great track record with story and narrative. So what we did is just get the expertise from those guys and kind of like create the peanut butter and chocolate experience. So what I'm going to do is just showcase to you the video that we showed last year at E3, so there's not gameplay elements into it, just to give you a taste of what the vibe of the game is going to be. And after that, I'm going to just talk about some low-level learning that we had making this game.
There was this sort of synergy of, well, we're looking to do something interesting in VR, and we've got this division, and you're looking to sort of bring, you know, what sense you have of storytelling within, and put that into the context of VR.
You can, for the first time as a player, feel like you are in a movie.
That's a really good word for it. We want you to take off the gear and still feel unsettled.
Whilst working with Ubisoft, we stumbled across some fascinating research that had begun in the late 90s. Essentially, neuroscientists had figured out a way to upload brain data, trauma, emotions, memories, to the digital space. Now, we've gone and taken the next logical step, and with Ubisoft, we've recreated in virtual reality one such test at a time. So we'd like you to come and join us and experience the Walter test case for yourself.
Not as a character, but for me.
Again,
experiencing is a recorded consciousness. It's not unlike watching a movie, so no matter how real it may seem, it can't hurt you. You are completely safe. We're completely safe.
Okay, so the game is a psychological thriller where you are, through the VR goggles, projected inside the brain of somebody else. And you're visiting and manipulating the memories of that person. And in terms of gameplay, what how we're approaching it is through like the walking simulator genre. So like in the last 5 years, every year, one of the top 5 game in the industry, best rated, is always like one of that game from that genre. So we had last year, What Remains of Edith Finch, the year before, Firewatch, Gone Home. And what's great about those games is that they take a really minimalistic approach to game design. So there's not that many features. It's not like Assassin's Creed where you have like the buffet of mechanics and gameplay. So there's a challenge of like, okay, let's do a couple of things really right, and then let the player be immersed on storytelling and the world and the house that we're making. So that's where we decided to focus on. But by it's not and by focusing on certain of those key mechanics, then suddenly it's like, wow, okay, the potential of VR or things what we need to do in VR started to become really apparent. So what we needed to do with that game, so we already knew how to walk or move around. Now it's how can we master looking and touching. So those are really simple things. But the problem is that every human has 20, 30, 40, 50 years of experience looking and touching real world. So then one of the first things that become clear is that the environment need to be one-to-one with reality. When you approach a counter, kitchen counter, you know the height of the kitchen counter, you know the height of the doorknob, you know the height of the ceiling, door frame, the size of a door. We all know that instinctively. So then even, for example, in level design in most games, what we do traditionally, you play Uncharted or games like that, and then the environments make no sense. They're made like snakes to allow loading between set pieces. But when you're in VR and you have a sense of scale and space and you are immersed in an environment, and that's where we want to keep players in. We want to have player being immersed in the moment they're in. in this simple game. Then suddenly, even the fact that the foundation of a house, if you go to the basement, would not line up, even for like, 10 centimeter with the wall on the first floor, then it's like it breaks the immersion. So for us, we had to start looking at, we've been building games or rooms a certain way for years. Now we need to throw that out and then use architectural plan, architectural structure. And once we use that, then suddenly after that, because our game doesn't happen in real reality, then we can start playing with those non-Euclidean space. Like, oh, now I believe in this space, and then what happened if I would push the wall 1 meter on the left when I come back? And it's like, ugh, you would feel that viscerally. That's an opportunity of VR, but that's also the cost of like, if I want to make a game believable, if I want to make the virtual reality believable, then I need to look more and more at the world. And the second one is believable, ordinary interaction. So already we were going to make that game inside a house because it's a family story. So the story happens inside our home. But homes have doors. Doors are the worst thing that you can design in a game, so you don't want to do doors. But when you have to do it, then it's the complication of like, okay, where do they open? Where do you put a door in? Anyway. But the biggest thing for us is opening a door and making it believable. First, you're not in virtual reality, even if you have now the touch controls, those touch controls, you're not touching anything. The dream of like, oh, I'm going to make a sword game in VR, it's going to be amazing. They all suck because you don't have that like kinetic feeling of the two swords clashing, so you're just swinging in the air. So I had to spend a lot of time tweaking, okay, so what's the movement that you need to open that door? So it appears simple, but then suddenly I know how to move, I know what feels right in terms of scale, and I can grab object, examine object, leave those objects in, open doors. Those for us are all like incredible opportunities, like in those details, and then suddenly you can, after that, scale the game to a bigger thing. And then once all those problems are solved, then people can get immersed in the story. Then you can work on the story. Then people are interested into opening drawers, finding a picture, turn that picture around. Oh, there's something right in the back. And play the game and being immersed in the virtual world. So then we're moving on past Basecamp 2. So that's going to be Transference. Like I couldn't show you because right now the game has been shown just behind closed door. It's a really intense playable demo that we've built for E3, and we're going to make that demo playable and available for everybody pretty soon. And the game is going to be launched later this year. So that's Basecamp 2, and for Camp 3, I'm going to pass back the mic to Chris, where he's going to talk about how do we take VR and bring it to the social space.
Great, thanks. So yeah, with a bit of motion in place and a bit of immersion, then the question that a lot of gamers come to is how can we be social in this space? I'm sure, like a lot of folks, some people's view of what is social VR is kind of like this: some guy in the basement somewhere, all wrapped up and talking to everybody, or not. Maybe it's his parents' basement. Who knows? But we set out to have this not be the case, right? And so, what do we do? How do we get to this place? And we made 2 games out of our Red Storm studio in North Carolina that were released last year. But Werewolves Within and Star Trek Bridge Crew. And so I have a little short clip on each of them so that if you have not played them, so you can see some of it. And then we'll come back and talk about the social features that went into making those games after the clips.
Welcome to the werewolf-plagued village of Galveston and the world of Werewolves Within. Werewolves Within is a social deduction game. As a player, it's your job to figure out which of the other players are trustworthy and who's being less than truthful.
You have no solid evidence against me.
You gotta prove that you're not the werewolf. Wait, me? No, I'm definitely a gossip.
Oh my gosh, I guessed right.
I mean, that's exactly what a werewolf would say, but...
Come on.
It was me the whole time.
I have determined that Javier is a gossip.
Cool, thank you.
So that means either Gabe actually is the houndsman, or he's the werewolf.
No!
I told you it was Cece.
Werewolves win!
So that's Werewolves Within. And now we'll take a quick look at Star Trek Bridge Crew. And this is the Engadget reporting team playing it. So you can see kind of their interaction. It's less about in-game, but a little bit of them and a little bit of in-game footage.
Message from Starfleet.
Captain, we have an emergency. Starfleet has lost all contact with Starbase ELO 4, and we fear the worst.
All right, you heard the man. We have a job to do. Let's go and do it.
Engaging warp, sir. Here we go.
Matthew, can you begin scanning the area, please?
Scanning. That doesn't look good. Uh-oh. There's a Klingon coming. Shall I scan him, sir?
Shields up, please.
Shields on. They're firing at us, sir.
Aaron, power to phasers and shields.
Got it.
All right, Matt, let's give him something to deal with. Phasers and photon torpedoes. Quick as you can.
Yes, sir.
Now, fire.
Pepper in him like pepper jack cheese.
That's not a phrase.
Still bringing us around.
Just nice, regular pulses.
Captain, I'm pulsing. I'm pulsing.
Oh, we still talking about Star Trek. Next, stay with him.
Turning us around, sir. Scotty, I love you.
Damn it, man, you're beautiful. Nick, get us out of here. We're about to die.
Get us back in, Sonny Jim.
So you can kind of see from the expressions in the room as well that a good half of the entertainment of this was the social interaction, not what we programmed into the game, but what the players brought to the table, right? And to make that work, it was a lot harder than we thought. And we learned a few lessons along the way about what was effective in creating social presence. So I'll talk about a few of these in brief, but this is kind of the quick list of the things where we ran into more problems than we thought we would have. First off is the head, the torso, the body itself. And you probably have seen these experiments where they basically put a block head on a block body, and they only move the block head in relation to what the VR headset is doing. And when you do that, and you're opposite another person who's in VR, you can tell. You can tell just by the motions of the block that's correlated to the motions of the headset that that's another human there and not an AI construct of some sort. And that's because of the little subtle motions that we all go through, that we're all doing right now as I'm talking, as you're listening, that has you recognize, oh, this is a human reaction. Where we needed to get from that space was to make sure that all of it was working together, so that as I talk, my body isn't rigid and I'm the talking head, because that looks really weird in VR and you realize something's wrong. And so it's getting all of those pieces to kind of flow together with a variety of like less than perfect inputs, because there's no input on elbows. Everybody has the elbow problem where in VR I do some pretty weird things, like suddenly I'm talking to you like this, right? Because nobody knows where my elbow is, and figuring out those problems. The second thing that we worked on, or had to work on, was as especially in Werewolves Within, less so with Star Trek. Star Trek is a forward-facing viewpoint, so 4 people are facing forward. Werewolves, you're around a circle, so you're looking at the players that you're interacting with. And suddenly, if you're in that bad movie where the lip sync is off, like it doesn't seem right anymore, right? So what we do is, we don't actually understand what the players are saying, but we look for phonemes and we move the character's mouth relative to what we're hearing, right? And if there's more enunciation or a louder volume, we amp up the expression that's going on in the character themselves to make it look like something's going on. So a lip reader could not actually read the lips of the person, but it does seem a little bit better than those movies where you see the da-da-da-da-da-da, and the person says, "Good morning," right? So it's better. It's better there. The other side, the next part was, and you can kind of see it even now as I talk, because I try to exemplify this. If I was standing up here and talking and looking around, you'd begin to wonder, like, what is he doing? Is he even paying attention to us? I don't know what's going on. Yet, if you look at all of our behavior in VR, that's exactly what we do. We stand there and we're looking everywhere, you know, especially even in the space where there's another person in the VR, virtual reality with you. You're not looking at them other than for a moment because, you know, they don't know, right? And so what we found was that was very disconcerting to have that kind of a conversation. So in each of these games, when we can kind of tell that you're looking at somebody, right, what we do is we snap the eyes to the eyes of the other character, right? And then suddenly, it's human-human communication because you're meeting the eye contact. But you don't want it to be the creepy eye contact, you know, the guy who just like stares at you for no length of time, for forever. And so as some other sound comes up in the environment, we have the player's eyes go off to the side briefly towards wherever that sound is because we have, as you'll see as we talk in a minute, positional audio. Right? So now suddenly, it's just like what goes on, and maybe a little bit too much in my household, where someone's always looking somewhere else. They're focused on me, I guess, right? But they're constantly looking away, and that's my cue that it's time to move on to the next point or whatever at home, and probably here as well too. So then the next is speaking and gestures and hand gestures. Originally, when we started coding this game, the touch controls were not out, so we did it off of a controller to begin with. So we had a series of gestures that you could do on the controller that would be like this guy or pointing at you, and you saw some of that in the video. And now it's even easier because you've got the touch controllers which include the gestures. But what we found also is the more somebody's voice was animated, the more we animated the motions of the character. Just like with the facial expressions before, we added, particularly before touch controls, body motion as well to help emphasize what was going on in the space to make it look like a more realistic conversation. And with hand tracking now, that makes it much easier, right? Because you're actually mimicking what people are doing. And lastly was the positional audio that you have the advantage of being able to spatially tell where sound is coming from and correlating that to what you're expecting to hear. It's sitting around the circle in Werewolves Within, you hear somebody from one side, you hear somebody from the other side. You can tell who's talking at that point. You don't need all the clues that you would normally have in a flat or 2D video game of who's talking or what's going on. I could be looking over here and I could still hear someone talking over here, and I know exactly who's talking, right? And it tends to work out that way. And then when we add in that on top of the other elements, it tends to keep bringing back that this is what we're expecting. And the good news is, you know, for us in this field is that if we do 80% of the work, 70, 80% of the work, our brains just fill in the rest, right? We don't have to get to 100% perfection, right? We've got this nice ability to blend in over what's going on. And what happened is it worked, right? So with all of this in place, some of the data that we have from Werewolves Within is pretty amazing for what we thought was going to happen. We found that over 1/3 of the people are staying in headset for more than an hour at a time. That's, you know, per session, not per game, because the game, you know, the games last 10 to 15 minutes or so on that. But they were staying in headset for a long time. And our lead player has hundreds of hours that they've spent in Werewolves Within in-game in this. So we've apparently done something right. And it's interesting looking at the press and the feedback, the commentary feedback in forums on this, is people talk about they're social in these games. They talk, they learn about each other, they make friends. This is, you know, what we had hoped for, probably earlier than we had hoped to achieve it, but it was happening, which was great. But it does bring up some potential for problems as well, some new things that we need to think about in social VR, right? Because now suddenly there's all kinds of new ways to grief people, Right? Not that any gamers really do this regularly, but occasionally I've heard there's a few that do. And suddenly now you've got to think about, like, what's the right amount of personal space that should exist in VR? I mean, like, it would be very easy to walk up and try to obstruct somebody's view, but it was also kind of be creepy and unsettling based on what they're doing at the time. So we found out, oh, I guess we have to code for that, right? Because people didn't necessarily all have the same space. Even culturally, it's different, right? When we think about what this game being coded in the United States would view as a relatively safe distance to be able to stand apart from somebody versus other cultures, right? Let alone if there's any griefing involved or anything else. The next part is, you know, I mentioned before that the Werewolves Within is kind of a circular arrangement, like around the tables that you're sitting at, and Star Trek is forward-facing. It's much easier to be social in that round-the-table environment because you're looking at other people. That's the focus. It's much harder to be social in the Star Trek alignment where everyone's facing the screen. So we actually found that what we accidentally did, was we gave each role different sets of information. And that helped everybody be more social. And so we ended up having to amplify that by giving the captain only certain amounts of information, giving the engineer only certain amounts of information, so they had to communicate more. And then it started going. Now, what you saw on the screen was a bunch of people who knew each other and were having a blast in the game, right? So that relationship is good. And we were worried that this would be only the case if people knew each other. And we found that it's not true. Probably partly because of the lore, and that people who are playing the game know a little bit about the lore of the game, but also because it just ends up being fun to work with other people, and you have to communicate because of the structure of the game. And that tends to get everything started. And that's where the balancing the interaction versus, the social interaction versus gameplay comes in. Because we went both ways. We had too little social interaction to begin with and too much information available to everyone. And we went too far the other way, which was we really restricted everything. So everyone had to communicate. And then, just like in real life, there are some people who communicate more or less than others. So finding the right balance versus covering it with gameplay versus forcing a social interaction was key to the enjoyability of the game. And then lastly, it was pretty straightforward for us in both of these games to figure out what was the social activity. Werewolves Within is all about the social activity of determining who's lying and who's telling the truth. And with Star Trek, the information and the communication, the fantasy of being on the bridge, right, is the social interaction. But in other games, we have to work a little bit harder to make sure that we have a good social construct or a reason to be social with other people in the game. So it doesn't just seem to be an artifice that's laid on top of a game and something that's unnecessary. So in both of these games, I think that we've figured a way to have people be social. People are playing them far more than we anticipated, from a session and from a length of time standpoint. So I'd say that we've at least comfortably set up this base camp, or the particular camp, and are able to move on and integrate it in our other games. So our fourth camp that we'll look at is kind of taking some of those elements from before. How do we combine fast action, like we learned a little bit about with Eagle Flight, and multiplayer, so people working together, right? And a little bit of the social that came in from the last two games we talked about. And we have a game in development in France called Space Junkies. And rather than talk a lot about it, it's a kind of a fast-paced multiplayer space shooter. Let me show you a little bit of a trailer and then chat about it.
Hey! Woohoo!
So we managed to pull a little bit of everything together there. You know, a little bit of the fast motion that's going on, a little bit of the shooter style, a little bit of the social side of things. This is a 2v2 or 1v1 arena-based combat game, and it works. People aren't uncomfortable playing it. It's pretty quick moving. We've tried it out with a few esports teams to see like, hey, how far can we really push? And they like it, and we like it a lot when they like it because they suck at it to start with. So you can actually win for a brief moment against some really good players for like an hour, and then it gets worse, you know, or they get better. I get worse. But for a brief moment, it's all good. And so this is just yet, I think, another step on our climb up towards what will be, you know, at some point a fully immersive game. You know, and is that the best game that's going to be there? No, probably not. It's going to be great. It's going to be, you're going to like it, but it's not that pinnacle that we all think of. It's not the dream yet. It's just one more step along the way. And so today was all about trying to figure out ways that we can convey some of the things that we learned, some of which was fun, some of which was painful, some of which was funny, all towards that quest of making something that's entertaining and exploring the new medium. Because really we didn't know, and we still don't know exactly, you know, the best way to do anything in this medium. And it's all about experimentation and trying to figure out what's right. And so if any of this was helpful today, that's great. That made it all worthwhile. If not, hopefully it was a little bit entertaining. And you know, we'll continue to learn ourselves and learn from the rest of the industry as well as we keep going forward in VR. So at this point, Pat and I will take any questions you might have.
With the Werewolves Within concept, and you were did you actually have to have people sitting with each other, or were they in separate rooms? Because I'm imagining the audio would be really weird if I could see the character on my left and he was speaking to me from the right because we were in the same space.
We did both, right? So the game is set up to run across the internet, assuming that most people won't be sitting together, right? We did in playtesting run across that exact problem, but what we found is by having better headsets, it shut out the outside world, and then it doesn't really matter. And so we found that people were talking to their right to the character who actually was over there. So the rest of us who are watching that were vastly entertained, right? But it wasn't so apparent to the people who are actually in the VR session.
Does Ubisoft still partner with indie studios for
We do.
VR? Yeah?
We do. Yeah, it's not as common as it probably has been in the past, but we do on a regular basis. We continue to look for ideas and areas that it can help reinforce, what we're doing in our studios. So, yeah.
Do you have a LBE strategy? Are you going to go into location-based entertainment?
We do. Great, because we're here in LA. We have a couple of partnerships already. One is with IMAX, where we're putting Star Trek Bridge Crew pods in the front of IMAX theaters. The first of those locations was here and in New York. And there's a special shorter session of the Star Trek experience where you can come together and either solo or with the people that are there do that. We have another company we've partnered with in France that is also doing the Star Trek experience. We have a Rabbids experience, which is not something that we make for the non-LBE experience. It's a Rabbids bobsled ride. It's in amusement parks in France and in Asia. What am I missing? There's a couple other.
Can't talk.
Yeah, exactly. There's a couple other things that we're working on. So yes, what we're finding is that the biggest challenge, from us is not the creation of the software, because we can think about that, but is that there's not a lot of commercially durable headsets today, and so in many cases there's an operator problem with the headsets being too fragile. They're not designed for the usage of on-off all the time element, but we'll get there.
So the new experiences, the Star Trek one, when will they be available?
They launched it now. Yeah, it's running now at Century City, I think, IMAX. It's in LA, not here in Anaheim, but I think it's in Century City.
I have a question.
Yes.
When you release a title like Star Trek Bridge Crew and people are playing it, do you track user experiences, user behavior in the game to improve that game or future titles?
We track a couple things in that, and you might want to talk about what we track in Eagle Flight as well, or otherwise. We look at both factors that we can measure: play length, engagement, length of time before what happens when individuals drop out. But we also have community forums where we have moderators that participate there as well to help moderate and understand what the player reaction to the games are. And that's actually probably where we get some of the best feedback, is when we see people talking about something, and these games are under ongoing development, so it's a great way to continue to reflect that back to us.
Yeah, so those games were not built as game as a service, so we're not tracking like where people died everywhere to change the map, because we're not going to change the map. But we can see the time played per session, progression level, time played in multiplayer versus single player, leaderboards, stuff like that. So then we can start seeing what drives more the engagement for the player, and then try to apply that to future titles. But after that, if the game would have been a multiplayer game as a service, then after that, there is value to track all that data. Otherwise, there's a moment where it's like, what are we going to really use it for at the micro level? So at that point, yeah, so that was the cutoff for us.
One interesting thing that we ended up tracking in both the two social games, Werewolves Within and Star Trek Bridge Crew, especially in the testing phase, is we realized that we could segment people into one of two camps pretty easily. There were communicators and there were participants. And participants generally communicated less, and if left to their own with only other participants, probably wouldn't communicate at all. So what we realized from a matchmaking algorithm is we needed to kind of label somebody as a communicator or as a participant, and then when we did matchmaking, because these are all multiplayer games, right? We needed to make sure we included communicators within each pool, because then somebody would start talking, and then that would make it okay for everybody to start talking. Right? You can imagine it at a cocktail party or something like that, 4 people walk up and everybody just stands there. That's rather awkward at that point. But as soon as the first person starts talking, then it's okay, and then everybody starts talking. But it was another one of those interesting discoveries, and thanks for the question, because it was a great point to bring up, is that we needed to look outside of the norms of what we would track and what we would look at from a matchmaking standpoint, and pull those together to enhance the experience for the players.
One more. I noticed most of the games that you were showing seem to be largely like PC-based, like high-end kind of 6-DoF, 2 controllers, all that kind of thing. Are you looking at all at the sort of lower-end, kind of mobile-ish type sets?
We do a number of mobile VR games as well, although today was really about what we've learned in trying to move the high-end experience forward. We have a Rabbids game, and we have a Hungry Shark VR game, and we have, I don't know.
Okay, so at least, so on my perspective, at Ubisoft Montreal, we're not doing anything mobile because it's not part of our DNA. So we're seeing games from a perspective or a prism and whatever. So that's our nature. The second one is there's on our perspective, maybe not enough interactivity. So what we like is to be able to touch, move. When you work on Assassin's Creed, you want to touch every wall. So there's a certain mindset, and that comes with a certain amount of firepower. But also the fact that you have controllers versus being really passive and watching. I think some of them can be great, but it's not going to come from us. So that's where diversity in a corporation is great, because then suddenly other people can come up with those mobile experience like the Rabbids.
Yeah, I mean, what Patrick's referring to is we have 30 different studios, and some are focused on mobile and some are focused on
So I guess, it's important to understand who you are, and after that, other people come up with different solutions, and it's perfectly fine. And then as soon as you're comfortable with one direction, then you know where you can move and forge your own path.
Hi, in social games, I notice that the biggest frustration sometimes is when you have the newbies mixed with the veterans. How do you guys handle that?
We think it's great, actually. because it tends to be, especially in the VR space, you learn from each other very quickly, right? So this is part of the communicator-participant issue I was talking about with Werewolves Within. And when we find we've got people mixed in who have played for a long time with people who are just starting off, it tends to work out well. I mean, unless the new person is really being a jerk, or the person who's been around for a while is you know, having a bad day or whatever, there tends to be this pull forward into the social experience.
Okay, so but what's important is Star Trek is a PvE game. So in PvE, depending on the opposition or the challenge that you have, if there's enough room, then somebody can become a mentor. If you can only win if everybody's performing at 100%, then that guy that performs at 80%, you hate him. But in multiplayer, in PvP, that's going to be a bigger problem for Space Junkie, because then you need matchmaking with skills. Otherwise, if I'm good, you make me lose, I don't like you, and you don't know how to play, so that you don't have a place to learn and to become better, then you feel bad for being the dead weight. So the nature of the game design affects the way that people are performing together. PvE, by nature, if you give the tools for communicating or help or whatever and reward for performing together, then suddenly that game is inherently more social in the group. In PvP, Werewolf, you don't necessarily have the problem. Team PvP, that's a problem. If it's individual PvP, like Werewolf, and you're a noob and you don't know how to react, and I'm going to win, so you know, where is the problem of having one or two new guys that we can play around with, and then they're going to learn the rules of the game and get better by playing it, which, you know, would be like a traditional board game behavior. But the social interaction are embedded in the design choice. That I really believe it. Like the more competitive you make a game and the more punishing the game is, then the people that are going around, like if the game design attracts griefer or allow griefers to exist, then griefers are going to come and create a toxic community. So the designer has a choice. Like, it's not random what we're making. Every designer has a choice of the type of experience and community he wants to build, and take that into consideration when you're making those choices and that balancing.
Great.
That's great. Thank you very much, guys.
Well, thank
that
you
was
all very
fantastic
much.
talk.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.